Okay, I'd like to start off our next session, with apologies for being a few minutes late. I want to introduce Monique Manach, who's a member of the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, and a knowledge keeper who's working closely with Elder Albert Dumont, and is a doctoral student at Carleton University. Monique is going to lead our next panel, to chair our next panel called Indigenous Media and Cultural Policy. And she'll introduce the presenters on the panel. And I want to thank Monique for putting this wonderful panel together that's going to be, I think, really interesting, and I think we'll all learn a lot. So Monique, thank you so much, and looking forward to all of your presentations.
Miigwech. Thanks, Sarah. Pajashig, welcome. I'm virtual today from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. Monique Manach, Indishnikos, Algonquins from Barrier Lake and Dojaba. My name is Monique Manach. I'm a member of the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. Today, we're going to be speaking with Dan and Mary Lou Smoke, with Gwen Phillips, with Rob McMahon, and with Jesse Wente. And we're going to begin with Dan and Mary Lou Smoke, who have been in community radio and within Indigenous media for 40 years?
31.
31.
Yeah.
Wow. And you have the longest running community radio program in Canada.
Indigenous community
Indigenous,
radio.
yes. Yes.
Okay. Smoke Signals out of Western.
Yes.
Yes.
Sending smoke signals your way.
So I'd like to start the conversation with you. If you could, talk to us for a few minutes about, what your thoughts on the digital Indigenous sector, and your experiences, your many and varied experiences.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Well, my elders taught me that when we're speaking, that we always say what our spirit name is, what our clan is, and where we come from. And every time we do a radio show, we always introduce ourselves this way. So we always greet one another as you greeted us. But we say, in my way, my Anishinaabe way, we say Bujo. So Bujo.
Bonjour.
Asanyenis Kwayan Dejnakas, Makwa Dodem, Bachwana Bay Dunjaba. So I just shared my spirit name with you, and that is Shooting Star Woman. I'm Bear Clan. I originally come from Bachwana Bay, Ontario, but most people around here know me as Mary Lou Smoke. So Dan and I started in radio 31 years ago. We started at the same station where we're at now, CHRW. And I think we had 50 watts back then.
Yes, that's right.
50 watts. So we didn't have, we're located in London, Ontario. Dan and I moved here in 1977 from Toronto. And we started the radio show in the 90s. And
1990.
yeah. And so the very first thing when we were offered this show, what was happening at the time was what they called the Oka crisis. And the only reason why they called it the Oka crisis was because the reporters couldn't pronounce Ganastagi. So the Oka cheese factory was just down the road. So they said, oh, it's the Oka crisis. So all the reporters were writing their reports by news bulletins by the police. And the same thing happened here at Ipperwash. So a fellow at the CHRW had a radio program called Green Waves, and he approached Dan and I and asked us if we would come on the air and give an Indigenous point of view of what was happening. So, well, we both looked at each other with big eyes, because somebody wants to know what we want to say, what we have to say. So the very first thing we did was we went on the air, and then we had lots of information. We brought in armloads of stuff to read. And at that time, email was fairly new, but I was still able to print off a lot of stuff. And then I started this one format called community announcements. So I would announce all the powwows and, events happening in city and surrounding area. And so after like our little 10-minute time on Green Waves Radio, hosted by Jeremy Price, we did this for about 6 weeks. Then the station manager, Mario Cicelli, offered us a 1-hour radio show. And that's when we said, well, I don't know, we better get some permission because we're permission seeking people. And so we went to our elders and we told them, that this is happening. We have this opportunity to share and we don't know if we should do it, because we don't want to be, we don't want to be attacked by our own people, which happens a lot, because people are always saying, well, who do they think they are, So anyway, the elders, said wholeheartedly, go ahead with it. We went to the sweat lodge and we had a sweat lodge ceremony just for the purpose of going forward with radio. And our elder, Art Solomon, said, you take every opportunity you can to talk about the goodness of the Indian people. Back then, people, nobody was saying Indigenous or Aboriginal. We were saying we were Indian. So we did that. And I learned how to run the board, so I don't know if you ever, a lot of people sitting in the audience probably never seen a control board, but there's like 100 little dials on there that you have to learn how to run and click and function, slide the thing up, the slider thing. I don't know all the technology either, but I had all these notes that, I'd put, this is for the CD, this is for the cassette. This is, I had this one said, make sure you turn Dan on, because a lot of times I forget to do that. And somebody called up saying, we can't hear Dan very good, So it was a real learning process because we never went to school for this, it just came our way. And so we took it. And so after about 2 or 3 months, the station manager, Mario Cicelli, he offered us a 2-hour radio show because he's seen we had all this information to share. We had this, for, I don't know, for thousands of years, our people had this knowledge and nobody told it, nobody shared it, So when there was gatherings happening at elders conferences, powwows, anything Indigenous was happening, Dan and I had this little wee tape recorder. We would travel, we'd hitch a ride with somebody, or, we'd take the train or go by Greyhound, but we would get there and we would tape record whoever was speaking, bring it back to the radio show, and then share it with all the Londoners and people who could listen, from Woodstock and beyond. And then after a little while, we got 75 watts and we could be reached in Guelph. So once the internet came, and, Dan and I started traveling beyond, just this area, we ended up like going down the States. We went to Europe a couple of times, down to Thailand. So we have people who listen from all around the world now because of the internet. And so it's really been fascinating, the changes that have been happening. And, we haven't really learned all the new things that are happening out there in the world, but we know enough to get by.
Well, okay, I'd just like to say, Chimiquets Marilu, Asanenas and Dishnakas, Kildare Dodam, Six Nations Grand River, Dinjiba. My spirit name is Star in Flight. I'm a member of the Seneca Nation, and I'm a member of the Kildare clan, and I come from Six Nations Grand River territory. My father was born down on Onondaga. He's Cayuga from the Turtle clan, but I was born down on the Onondaga Reservation, Syracuse, New York. Anyways, I would just like to say I'm very grateful to Sarah and to Monique for this opportunity to share at this conference. And I believe that we are in good company. So I want to say Bonjour, Sago, where I come from, we say Sago to all of our fellow presenters. And I just want to say in relation to what Mary Lou was talking about, yes, we were presented this opportunity to share on the radio, and it was very fortunate to us that it was in the oral tradition. Our people are an oral tradition. We share orally from generation to generation, wisdom, knowledge, and it's passed on. And it's passed on from generation to generation. We have been very fortunate that we have been the beneficiaries of like in the Haudenosaunee tradition. My grandmother was a Kildare Seneca Nation clan mother, and my grandfather was a Seneca Deer Clan hereditary chief. So they're both very important in the Onondaga Longhouse, which they were lifetime members. And my family have there's a lineage of membership in the Onondaga Longhouse on Six Nations. One of their helpers was a hereditary chief who was quite well known by the name of Chief Jake Thomas. He was Cayuga Nation. He was Sandpiper Clan. So he was member of the, that's the same bird family as the Kildare. So he was like an uncle to me. But I met him because he was a runner for my grandparents, and he would drive them around. So I got to meet him, and I didn't know that he was such a well-respected, well-regarded knowledge carrier. But he knew all the 6 languages of the Haudenosaunee language family, and he knew the ceremonies, and he knew the recitals, the addresses that are said whenever we do a ceremony. He knew the actual speech that goes with it. And so, and he would talk about that to my grandparents, because they would help him in passing on some of their knowledge and wisdom to him. And I was just a young guy. I was like 7, 8 years old, 9 years old, and I would be just tagging along. And because I liked spending time with my grandparents. They were my favorite memories on the Six Nations Reserve. And they would go off to various little cultural events where there was a group of dancers, there would be some food, there would be some speakers, and then there would be my grandmother selling crafts, because my grandfather was a good craft person, and my grandfather would be a singer. So he would sing and the dancers would dance. So then I got recruited into becoming a dancer, even though that was against my wishes. My grandmother insisted that I learn how to dance. So I started dancing. And Jake Thomas sometimes came. And so he witnessed that I was just a young guy who was trying to learn how to dance my Haudenosaunee style of dance, even though I didn't really want to do that. But because I was kind of thrust onto the stage, I kind of picked up on it. I kind of enjoyed it. I thought it was good. Anyways, I started learning a little bit about the knowledge of our people. I didn't learn the language because my parents, even though they knew the language, sometimes spoken between them, they never shared it to us because of what they went through with the residential school. We had the Mohawk Institute, which was a residential school, was located right in Brantford. And my father went there, and my mother didn't, but she because she was taken away from Six Nations and grew up in Buffalo, New York. And so they met when my father ended up in the hospital in Buffalo, and she was a nurse. She was working as a nurse. Anyways, they met, and my father was a well-known, a well-regarded iron worker. So he was a welder, and he went where the work was. So we traveled around our small little family. There was 4 kids and my parents. So we got to travel around. Anyways, I got into the learning about our knowledge, learning about our traditions from Six Nations, which was a great hot spot for that. We had the Six Nations pageant where they put on plays, and they did it in an outdoor theater, forest theater, they called it. And that was very learning for me, because my mother would go and be an actress in the forest theater. And sometimes I came along as an extra, as one of the little kids. So I got to learn how to do that. And this was at a time in the early 60s. And I was starting to learn some of the stories of our people. You know, I learned about Red Jacket. I learned about Pauline Johnson. In fact, we lived at the Pauline Johnson homestead on the Six Nations Reserve, where my mother was the caretaker for 10 years. It was her first job that she got when she went home to Six Nations. And that was the job that she took and she was accepted to do. So collectively as a family, we all helped out running the Pauline Johnson homestead known as Chiefswood. And it was a home that was it was constructed out of walnut, great home, very solid, still standing, very solid still. But one door faced the Six Nations Reserve and the other door faced the Britain, because Pauline Johnson's mother was British and her father was a hereditary chief of the Mohawk people. And so they recognized both backgrounds, and they grew up with the influences of both backgrounds. So it was very interesting to learn about Pauline Johnson's home life, her growing up years, and then she became a performance artist on the Chautauqua circuit, reciting her poetry, and she became famous, and she ended up in Vancouver, but after she had gained some fame, and she traveled across to all the different performance theaters across Canada, and she ended up retiring in Vancouver. And so I was always very enamored of the stories about Pauline Johnson and the rest of her family and her parents. So, but it wasn't until, but at the same time, I was also very self-conscious about that too, because when I was reading the history books, I was reading about how we weren't seen and regarded as being very honorable people. We were looked upon as savages. We were looked upon as pagan. So it wasn't until I started to go out and learn for myself and see with my own eyes how beautiful our people were. Like I regarded my grandparents as two of the most beautiful human beings. They didn't drink. They went to Longhouse. They had a very simple lifestyle, but they enjoyed life. And so that made me very happy, because they were very happy, peaceful people. But but still that influence of negative stereotype, negative media bias really affected me, and it affected my self-esteem. It affected my self-worth, and I had a very much an inferiority complex. And sometimes I wished I wasn't Indian. I wished I wasn't Haudenosaunee, Seneca. And so I kind of grew up with that kind of mixed feeling. But it wasn't until I actually started to get an education. My mother always instilled in me that you need to get an education. And she never told me about how education is our buffalo. But I read about it many years later, and I recognized, buffalo was the way of life, and upon which the people out west lived upon for their survival. And so education was something that we regarded in the same way. And so I thought that I better get a good education. So I proceeded to do that. I ended up going to a boys' school called St. Andrew's College, just north of Toronto, in a place called Aurora. And I went there for my high school, grades 11 to 13. And then from there, I went to university down in Lenni Lenape territory in New Jersey, an Ivy League school called Princeton. And I went there, class of 77. And then from there, I came back to Toronto. And that's when I met up with Mary Lou, and we began a family. And we've been together ever since. And we've always decided that, Mary Lou kind of decided for us that everything that was going to transpire in our life, we would have to face it head on together. We would do everything together. And that worked for me, because I remembered my grandparents, and they did everything together. So in that kind of tradition, I thought, well, geez, I'm going to do this with Mary Lou. And I really enjoyed that, because Mary Lou at that time was a singer, entertainer, performer with a guitar. And she sang in Toronto at all the different Native venues, whenever there was a conference and they needed entertainment. Well, the Association for the Native Development and Visual Performing Arts, Jim Buller, would call up Mary Lou and to ask her to come and sing at such and such a venue for this group of people. And so Mary Lou would come. And so every now and then I'd see this beautiful woman playing her guitar. And I thought, geez, I'd like to meet her someday. Well, that opportunity happened one time when I was in the Silver Dollar Tavern, and And a friend of mine in the Silver Dollar Tavern that I worked with, her name was Diane Longboat, asked me to come over to her table. And she said, I want you to meet a friend of mine. Dan, this is Mary Lou. Mary Lou Sloss, this is Dan Smoke. And so I got to meet Mary Lou. And I remember seeing her on the stage of the Silver Dollar on a couple of occasions. And I thought, what a beautiful woman. So gorgeous. And what a voice, the way she sings, I really captivated me. So I was so happy to meet her. And right away, we started flirting. And it was almost like we were old friends who became reacquainted later in life. And we just joined up and started to walk together into the future. And so, as Mary Lou said, in 1990, we were offered this opportunity to get into radio, which we took. It was a 2-hour program that we started, and for I would say the first 15 years, we recorded everything. We were told never leave home without your tape recorder. And a friend gave us a really good Sony tape recorder. So we used that, and that was I think we got about 2,000 cassettes, different lengths cassettes, but that's how much we accumulated. And then when our station became digitized, everything went digital, and analog was phased right out. And we got into CDs, and we got into USB ports. But Mary Lou always was at the controls. She allowed me to be kind of like our voice, but oftentimes I would engage Mary Lou in banter, radio banter, and we would talk about our life. And I think our listeners liked hearing and eavesdropping in on some of our stories of our life together, and how we saw life, and how we saw life through our eyes. That was very engaging for the public to eavesdrop in on. And it was like we were just sitting across the coffee table and just talking and just sharing. But then we had a lot of stories to report. We also did a lot of traditional teachings, and we also did a lot of oral history of wampum belts, art. Mary Lou comes from a place where they had a lot of petroglyphs up in around Lake Superior.
Yeah.
So you had all that art on the rocks, and you guys kind of discovered all these paintings on the rocks. And you would and she would tell me about some of the paintings that you saw. So anyways, radio became our full-time pastime.
But it also led to other things. We got asked to start teaching at the university. So we taught a course.
Well, we did the TV first.
Oh yeah, we got asked to speak on TV. On Friday nights, we did a commentary on the news. So that was pretty scary. I don't know if any of you remember, there used to be a commercial about country cornflakes, where this man and woman were standing in front there, and they were holding their cornflakes and their pitchfork, and their eyes were just really big, and they're saying, please buy our cornflakes. And that's what Dan and I looked like our first time that we were aired on the TV. And about 6 months later, we took a tape of that first one and a current one like that was 6 months later, and we took it down to NAJA, Native American Journalists Association, and they did a critique, and they could not believe the difference, how relaxed we were, and how our presentation had improved. And so we did that for 20 years. We had a contract it was Chum, City TV, CTV. The station went through different names,
Different owners.
Yeah, owners. And so we were retired from that in 2018. In 2006, we got asked to teach a course at the journalism school here in London. So we taught about representation of First Nations in the media. And then we started teaching about Indigenous spirituality, focusing on the Anishinaabe, which I am mostly, and Dan with the Iroquois. So 2 years ago, we got approached by FIMS, the Faculty of Information Studies. We were leaving our office that we've had since the 90s, since we started the radio show. And so somebody saw some cassettes that we discarded, and they said, oh, this is a shame, these should be preserved. So it went from one person to another, and then they contacted us, and I brought all the cassettes home. So the one that I left behind was a duplicate. And so they contacted us and they said that they would like to take our music and preserve it and get it digitalized. And so they have done that. They got a grant. And so all that music has been transferred over.
I know it was interviews, panel discussions,
Yeah.
keynote speeches, etc.
All these teachings.
That's
You know, a lot
fantastic.
of those elders have gone now. So that's
Yeah.
all been preserved. And so there's going to be just one room at the Faculty of Information Studies where Indigenous students can go in and do research and have access to those recordings.
It's going to be virtual.
It's going to be virtual, and they're hiring Indigenous students like for the summer to go in there and transcribe everything. So that it'll also be available on print.
Well, no, it's all going to be digital.
Amazing.
All digitalized, yeah.
Digitalized, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. You guys have had such a life, such an amazing career and contributions to Indigenous media. It's absolutely wonderful.
And we met all you people along the way.
Yeah, that was
Well, we're the
nice.
fortunate ones.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kachimigwich. Thank you so much
Oh,
for sharing with us. And yeah, I look forward to more conversation with you.
Yes.
I'm gonna go to Gwen next. And Gwen, can you maybe introduce yourself a bit and tell us more about what you do?
Most certainly, and thank you very much for those stories. I don't think I've had the privilege of meeting you, but it sounds like we might have been doing some similar work at a similar time. I was the former chair of the BC First Nations Communication Society way back when, and we ran radio operations and print operations and did a similar thing in looking to don't leave home without that device. And moving from, I've got myself and personal records of digital wax recording, or the wax recordings, digital reproductions of wax recordings
Wow.
of my great grandfather in Ottawa in the 1960s, basically declaring sovereignty. And they also recorded them singing a number of songs. So I'm very fortunate to have that archival material saved for us. So absolutely, so I am Gwen Phillips, Red Arrow woman from the Ktunaxa Nation in southeast corner province of British Columbia. We're also in northern Montana and Idaho. We were buffalo hunters, but we're primarily living in the mountain regions, just inside of British Columbia, down into Montana and Idaho, as I've mentioned. And I've worked for my nation for over 40 years, and primarily for the past 20, supporting governance transformation and transition. And what really that is, and I apologize that I'm looking both sort of here and here. This is my big screen over here, but the little camera's over here. So just apologies, you're going to get my better side, I think. And I've been in that work for my nation for the past 20 years approximately in governance, also looking to assert data sovereignty, because data sovereignty is really a leading act of self-determination. I also am what's known as the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative champion. I have, in doing that work for my nation, been recognized for it, and was asked to sit on the First Nations Information Governance Center Board, a national institution that is moving a vision forward that each nation achieves data sovereignty within their own worldview. That institution has been in existence for 10 years, but it's only been in the past 5 or so years that we've really shifted our focus to really look at the needs of the nations. I also co-chair a national working group with Indigenous Services Canada and Indigenous people from across Canada that are doing planning and community development work inside their own communities. And we see this really as an opportunity to move forward and bring voice back to our people, where we've really had not much voice, with the exception of brilliant people like yourselves, the Smokes. So we understand that when the day we're in right now, with media convergence is, providing easier access to information on things that we want and perhaps need, but it's also providing information on things we don't want and don't need. And it's almost more difficult for me to find my way through to the things I need anymore with the things that are going on in tracking and promoting and getting in your way with all these sort of delivered messages that we're not asking for. And while technology has made our lives easier, it's also caused a lot of damage as we look at missing information, lack of information, too much information, inappropriate information, misleading information, and what we know as fake news. And the number of digital devices that people are using in their homes now to actually get access to this media, which is really feeding this thing that we've lost inside of us, this sense of feeling good. It's trying to feed that for us. And the amount of these devices that we've got going on in our homes now, we don't even know what that electromagnetic energy is doing to us, and how fragile our systems are as humans, and the dependency. We are electromagnetic beings. The synchronization of all beings with the energies of the earth and the moon, the stars. It's direct and it's deep, and we don't understand what these things we're doing are doing to ourselves right now. I recently participated in the BC Office of the Human Rights Commissioner's project on looking at a research project on disaggregated data. I suggested that in that research project that the move of government and of society really is getting a little scary to me. And I brought in the thought about Big Brother back in the day. And I've got 4 big brothers, and I've been wooed by them over the years, believe me. And I thought about the concept of bringing grandmother into the room, because just as you said, grandmothers are so important. And in my world, my 2 grandmothers were the most important people to me. And I suggested that the use of data should be thought of from a grandmother's perspective, that we should be using it in ways in which to bring care back into the conversation. And the government of Canada, those that do to us, for us, with us sometimes, we see them, like all organizations, building capacity to use data in ways that we didn't know were possible before, linking data sets, etc. And a few years back, I got a little bit, when I saw a memo that indicated that Indigenous Services Canada and Stats Canada were working together, and by joining data sets, they would be able to track the socioeconomic experience of an individual Indian over the past 30 years. And I'll use the term Indian, status Indian, under the Indian Act 60200380001. That's really the only label that's culturally appropriate. So they can call me Indigenous, Aboriginal, Native, First Nations, whatever else they've been calling me. But really, Tunaqa is the only one that is culturally appropriate in my worldview. And so I get afraid when I think about the use of data without my informed knowledge or consent. And I fear that we're facing not just Big Brother, but the whopping granddaddy of invasivity. We're seeing our privileges and our privacy being restricted by accesses with digital codes and passwords. And I'm starting to feel like I'm a digital slave. Like I don't get access to any privilege of society without paying for it. I have to pay for a paper bill. I'm expected to have an account to do all my banking and everything online, and I have to pay for it if I don't. And that's just so that they can get more data on me, that they can throw a few cookies my way. And the next thing I know, there I got another ad has popped up. And so I ask myself, are we really thinking about what we're doing when we're bringing artificial intelligence into the room, and when we're doing these things from this point of ease to make life easier or make somebody else richer? Are we thinking about what we're doing to and for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and those that are to come? I worry about what's happening to the human emotion. And in my world, I was taught that our intellect is here, that our spirit is here in our heart, that our emotions are in our stomach, and that the physical body wraps it all together and helps those energies communicate with one another. And I see what's happening as we're being fed this intellectual fodder that's not necessarily connecting to our hearts, or maybe it is, or maybe our hearts have been removed and it's connecting directly to our emotion. But whatever's going on, I don't feel good about it. Yes, I appreciate being able to access knowledge quickly, but is that the knowledge I want? Is that the truth? I'm not sure anymore. Not to say that data is not a useful thing and the connectivity that's going on is not useful. Our people have been disconnected from their home identity, their identities in general. And so data and data sovereignty and these information systems and various platforms can be used to reconnect people, to re-empower people and bring voice back. But as my people said, we've got to know that the use of technology is fine, but a tool can also be a weapon. And so we've got to take care and be careful as we move these things out into the world. In Canada, there are 89 distinct Indigenous nations, 89 linguistic identities existing right now. We speak the Dunakha language. It's an isolate language. It's related to no other language in the world. Where in Canada, there are 11 Indigenous language families, the Dunakha stand alone as one of those Indigenous language families. And our identity has been gnawed away at and chewed away at, so we almost don't exist anymore. And so it's so important to give recognition to each of those individual nation groups, to honor those languages and the knowledge and the technologies that go along with those knowledges. And so when I think about the grants that are available for media projects, et cetera, I think it would be good for the nations to actually be privileged to receive some of those monies, to be able to then identify their own citizens without any question who the people are that should be accessing the grants. Because even lately we've heard certain people putting a label on themselves to get a grant, and then later that label is questioned. So let's empower the nations to be nations again, to control our identities, to be those strong, healthy citizens that we envision in the future. Archaeological evidence says my people have been in our territory for over 10,000 years. We've always had government, we've always used data, we've always made informed decisions. We had a duck chief, a deer chief, a camp chief, a war chief, men's and women's societies. Our women owned the camps. What did the colonizers bring to us? Man, you own your wife. She's your property. Dispose of her if you care. Property law was where marriage was located. We have a very different belief system, very different values. And unless we can figure out what Canadian values are now, because I'm not sure what they are. I'm not sure whether we should be advancing these things, these policies, these privileges without having those deep conversations. Values clashes are real. And since contact, we've seen what that value clash has done to Indigenous women and girls. We're still living it. The Indian Act is still discriminating. So let's be cautious about our use of technology and even about our use of words. And for me, getting older as a grandmother that I am, I so much appreciate that our young people are becoming savvy in today's world and the technology of today, but they're also grounded in their worldview. They're using the tools of today to advance their interests and the beliefs that we have. And hopefully together, these knowledges will help to create that future that we all envision, where we have healthy land. My people believe that everything has a spirit, everything, not just humans, not just trees and animals, but the rocks, everything. And so be careful how we use things, because that spirit is unknown sometimes, and it can be brought to life given the right environments. And so Indigenous rights are communal. They don't belong to individuals, but individuals assert those rights. And so recognizing that the control of intellectual property and even the ownership of intellectual property is not necessarily acknowledged at this time with respect to Indigenous peoples' intellectual property, our worldviews, our collective ownership, and our necessity to ask for the right to do things, to ask for privilege, to seek privilege. We've lost a lot of that because of the colonial pressures and the lateral violence and the scarcity of resources that we've been faced with. But that deep, deep, deep sense of feeling, belonging, and knowledge of connectedness, it's there. And we will bring it back. We are nation rebuilding. We are going back to bring forward. And Indigenous people are no longer settling for what the federal government has said to close the gap. Close the gap. Which gap? The gap between ourselves and Canadians? That's just assimilation being measured. We want to close the gap between who we are and who we want to be in the future. Each of those 88 unique Indigenous groups, 89 counting Métis as a hybrid, post-colonial, post-contact nation, because the very concept of Métis is, of course, a bringing together of different groups with a hybrid language and culture. And so acknowledging the difference between those that have inherent rights that go back thousands of years and those that have more current Aboriginal rights and rights that are, of course, to be honored, but there is a difference. And so as we move forward, it's so important that each one of those unique nations is given the recognition. And now as the federal government is moving towards acknowledgement in full form of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, by looking to pass legislation in Canada, I would hope that they are considering how important intellectual property ownership is to a nation. Parlez-vous français? I asked a federal colleague. Of course, he said, I'm French speaking Canadian. I said, so you understand how important language is to the sense of identity, the sense of belonging, and the sense of purpose. I know how sovereignty is in Quebec. So as each one of us as nations starts to stand up, the recognition is there, but we also need to be resourced in order to do the work we know we need to do, to rebuild, to reclaim. And in British Columbia, we actually have UN DRIP law that's been passed, DRIPA Act, the DRIP Act. And that act acknowledges, of course, that they have to consider the diversity of the Indigenous people in British Columbia, that they have to relate to the rights holders as we move these concepts of recognition and hopefully some reconciliation forward. And so in getting ourselves ready for this work, Indigenous people across BC and across Canada have really been working collaboratively to make best use of that collective energy. We know the divide and conquer has done a lot of damage to us. And so rebuilding, reconnecting, reclaiming, and reconfiguring our energies to do the work we need is where we are right now. And so for the past 10 years almost now, I've been leading what's called the BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative. And again, that's because my nation has been asserting data sovereignty as an act of recognition. And in doing that, what we've done is we've created policy frameworks, we've created templates for different types of agreements, we've created all kinds of papers, research papers that have explored things like measuring the nation-to-nation relationship. And those documents can be found on a website, bcfndgi.com, BC First Nations Data Governance Initiative.com, including, and that website includes other things besides just, data conversations. It really does start to bring conversations about humanity back to the table. And so again, when I think about the work we're doing here and how we're doing it, we're not just doing it in BC, but BC First Nations leaders have pushed for, and other nations have joined the call for, a national First Nations data governance strategy to be born. And it has been drafted and it has been tabled. And for those of you like me in First Nations communities who watch the budget like it's Christmas time to know whether we're going to get anything this year, I was elated to know that this year the budget announcement indicated that there would be millions of dollars coming for further development of and implementation of this data strategy, through which each nation will be achieving data sovereignty within their own worldview. That is our end goal. And so history has proven over time that morals change, mediums change, media changes, and as do the values of the society. The full impact of contemporary media convergence is not well understood in the current era of 5 seconds of fame, quick to defame, a voice without name, no sense of shame. And I am most concerned for the children's health, as it can be deeply impacted when they are traumatized in their developmental years. Epigeneticists have proven that early childhood trauma, fetal or early childhood trauma, will result in a disease later on in life. They've proven inflammatory disease, but now we look at the social media and what it's doing to our young people. The numbers of people that are experiencing mental health issues, the numbers of suicides, the numbers of all of these negative statistics have driven up exponentially, as has the amount of information technology and the amount of information in general, and not just information, but opinions that are being pushed at them daily. So let's bring our hearts and minds together as we consider the future. And in the Ktunaxa language, Knishwik Yatl means to think, and it literally means to bring your heart and mind together. Thank you.
Kachimigwich, Gwen. Thank you. I loved, this is so amazing. So many, I was looking up all these different things as you were speaking because I couldn't, your talk was so full of resources and so full of really information, really important information. I thank you. I thank you very much, Miigwech. So next, we're going to turn to Rob McMahon from the University of Alberta. He is an associate professor in the Masters of Arts in Communications and Technology program. Prior to that position, Rob worked as a postdoctoral researcher with the First Nations Innovation Project at the University of New Brunswick, and he co-founded the First Mile Connectivity Consortium, a national nonprofit association of Indigenous technology organizations. His research focuses on the development, adoption, and use of broadband and internet technologies by rural, remote, northern, and Indigenous communities. His approach involves working with communities to ensure that their voices are heard in all stages of research. He and his partners are exploring ways to house project data and build research capacities in communities and are involved in efforts to contribute to digital policy and regulation. So we'll turn it over to you next, Rob.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for the privilege and opportunity to join this wonderful panel. Wow. Yeah, I'm just letting everything sink in. What an amazing group of speakers today. So I'm a non-Indigenous person too. I'm a white first generation settler, actually. My parents coming from Europe, my mom from Sweden, my dad from Wales. And right now I'm working in Treaty 6 territories, but I'm living in Kowitsin, the Cowichan tribes area in Vancouver Island. And I'm working in different research, policy, and educational initiatives. And I'm very privileged to present here today on behalf of a whole group of people that I have the honor to work with through groups like the First Mile Connectivity Consortium. So I'll be talking about their work in setting up and operating and building internet systems. So I'm going to turn to sort of like the underlying infrastructures, the wires that connect us, the wireless infrastructure, that kind of stuff, and also focus on some of the policy aspects, both the barriers and then maybe some proposals. So Dan and Mary Lou, like what you were talking about in terms of, you had all this work and you learned how to do it in that community radio context. And I thought that was such an amazing story. And I just wanted to say the same thing is happening in communities on the internet side. So there's so many people who are building their own infrastructures, operating it, maintaining it. And so I really want to highlight all of that work that I've really enjoyed and have the privilege to learn about as a researcher. So during COVID-19, we're seeing more activities are moving online, while at the same time, the pandemic is further exposing longstanding connectivity issues. But of course, as we've heard today, and we always hear that Indigenous peoples are asking important questions about who, when, how, and why broadband is deployed in regions and communities for a very long time. Today, I'll present some recommendations raised by Indigenous technology experts and organizations, and through discussions at the annual Indigenous Connectivity Summit. And I'll focus specifically on geographically rural and northern communities, many of which have small populations, sometimes fly-in communities or winter roads. So there's a long history of diverse Indigenous governments, citizens, and organizations acting as producers, owners, and operators of digital infrastructures in these regions. In First Nations contexts, KNET, or the Kukana Network, that means for everyone everywhere, which is owned and operated by the Kiwetnik-Okimakanik Tribal Council in Northwest Ontario. It's been around since 1994, the very early days of the internet, and it's still operating today, connecting some 80 communities and operating their own mobile phone services through KNET Mobile. There's also local initiatives like the Mamawapuan Technology Society in Maskwacis, just 1 hour of Edmonton, where a young champion there, Bruce Buffalo, is sharing his own connection and reaching people within the community who otherwise wouldn't be able to access internet services, just 1 hour away from Edmonton. In an Inuit context, the Tamani Network is a project of the Kativik Regional Government, and they're now deploying fiber to the home and undersea fiber optic cables, fixed wireless, and satellite links to 14 fly-in communities in Nunavik in northern Quebec. So these and many other successes present strong evidence that nonprofit Indigenous service providers are more than capable of constructing and managing networks in some of Canada's most challenging terrain, and then using them to deliver applications, including core public services like health and education. So policy plays a role in supporting and enabling these Indigenous broadband initiatives. But principles of broadband development operate differently in small population and geographically dispersed communities. Competition threatens to undermine cooperation in low resource environments. So rather than cooperating to support community initiatives, competition encourages individuals and organizations to secure limited resources, whether it's funding, whether it's customers, whether it's access to support structures like hydro poles to hang fiber optics or spectrum, in a zero-sum game. People are competing with each other. Companies are competing for these resources. So rather than competition, there's an opportunity to provide support to the Indigenous connectivity organizations that exist to serve the needs of their nations and communities. So after initial capital investment and ongoing operational supports, which I'll note are the same supports that private sector organizations ask to receive in these contexts, nonprofit organizations can reinvest any surplus revenues back into the community. So rather than go towards shareholder profits, surplus revenues might be used for activities like deploying or updating infrastructure, improving the quality of service, lowering prices for users, or supporting other projects that are decided on by the community owners. As we've heard today, their work also supports Indigenous sovereignty over connectivity, infrastructure, and services, and the associated applications and platforms. So a whole community approach, such as developed by Susan O'Donnell and Brian Beaton, provides a holistic broadband planning framework that considers residents and households, community institutions, or so-called anchor tenants. These are the big users of bandwidth that help make these types of community-owned operations sustainable over time. So the health centers, the schools, all these different areas that Indigenous nations are delivering services to their citizens. The regional telecommunications transport infrastructures that connect multiple communities, and then the surrounding lands, waters, and space reflecting environmental considerations. Secondly, I'll turn to the measurement of connectivity. So mapping initiatives are important for guiding the development of funding programs and how we deploy spectrum licenses, as well as for monitoring and measuring their impacts. And I'll note that in 2018, the Office of the Auditor General of Canada pointed out limitations of existing measurement approaches to connectivity in what they call rural and remote regions. So generally, there's very limited publicly available data in many smaller northern rural communities, places like Paulatuk and Uluhuktuk in the NWT. Criticisms have also been raised regarding the mapping methodologies used. So for example, if a single point of connection is shown as connected in a 25-kilometer hexagon, that whole area is considered connected. There's also issues with the maps used to determine spectrum licenses. So many of these spectrum licenses cover very large areas and might include 1 or 2 urban centers along with many smaller towns. But if a few urban centers are shared, the deployment requirements associated with the spectrum licenses may be considered as being met. So that in turn leaves many smaller geographically rural areas without service. There's also very limited data available on metrics like affordability or quality of service or experience, how people actually experience their connection, or the availability of dark fiber or conduit that is already built and people may not be using it. Why not actually map and use these assets that may be available? So in Canada, ISED and the CRTC recognize these data limitations and provide some mechanisms to check existing maps, and these might be expanded in the areas noted earlier. Other supports might include resources for people living in rural regions to contribute community source data, and doing so help sort of monitor this type of data. So third, I'll talk about funding criteria and access to funding mechanisms. So funding for broadband deployment and operations in these areas should be treated separately than funding in urban areas. The contexts are very different. So funding should be dispersed in a manner that's responsive to proposals that are generated by or in close consultation with Indigenous communities and the nonprofit service providers based in and operating in the affected regions. Specifically, proposal-based funding models allow for more customized approaches and factors that better reflect the desires and contexts of Indigenous nations and communities. So for example, they could help address the access divides inside communities by ensuring equitable deployment of connectivity to all households and organizations. Requests that applicants to the funds provide demonstrated evidence of community consultation and tangible benefits like training and employment for local residents. Integration with anchor tenants like local schools, health centers, and so on that provide economies of scale and cost savings, and then recognition of cultural, language, and environmental requirements identified by communities, and supporting affordability goals for when people actually have purchased their service. Nonprofit organizations located in Indigenous communities may require alternative financing supports in cases where they may face structural barriers. So while organizations based on reserve face barriers using on-reserve assets as collateral when they're attempting to receive and secure loans, there is a process in place whereby a First Nations band can do that. And then we're also seeing some improvement. So for example, the Canada Infrastructure Bank actually launched a new fund in March that non-for-profit organizations can access. So fourth, just technological considerations. So the characteristics of the connectivity technologies. Regional backhaul fiber optic networks, which are essential for connectivity. These are the regional networks that the communities will connect to. So you have the connectivity inside a community, but of course they connect to regional networks as well to access the broader internet. These must be made open access, and the definition of what open access is must be made clearer. It's really hard to track and follow and interpret what that is. The pricing of wholesale bandwidth. So if you have a local community organization that is purchasing bandwidth from these larger entities, that should be regulated in cases where the backhaul, the transport networks have been built through publicly subsidized funds, especially when cases where competition is not in place to help manage costs. So price regulation is more efficient than just overbuilding more transport areas, especially in northern regions where it's so expensive and difficult to do so. There should be more investment in internet exchange points in northern Indigenous areas that help support connections and lower costs, and also provide environmental benefits by reducing reliance on faraway cloud services and data centers. So for example, there's a proposal underway to build an Arctic internet exchange involving IXPs in Iqaluit, Inuvik, and Labrador City. So turning to spectrum, some mobile carriers are warehousing spectrum, so they own it without deploying it. And there are limited opportunities for Indigenous groups to lease that and offer services to their citizens. So to improve access, we may consider solutions like rural remote broadband systems policy, as has been documented by Dr. Greg Taylor, or Indigenous spectrum licenses, such as those provided to tribal entities in the US. So in the US, the FCC set up a tribal priority window for a band of 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, which is suitable for both mobile coverage and fixed point-to-point uses. And this program allowed for Native American communities in rural areas to directly access unassigned spectrum over their territories. So I took a look at their tribal priority window from February to September 2020 and counted 350 applications. So some groups like had more than one application, but that demonstrates the demand and interest in this type of program down south. The last thing I'll mention with technology is satellite license conditions. So in the past, Indigenous nonprofit telecommunications providers serving rural and northern communities were able to access public benefits satellite capacity as a condition of the orbital licenses required to launch satellites.
Mm-hmm.
And so proposals for launching these constellations, Starlink, etc., they've been released by multiple parties, some supported through several $100 million of public funding. So could an amount of reserve capacity on these satellite systems be made available to nonprofit Indigenous providers? Initiatives could also support small scale deployments led by communities as well. So there's local mesh networks, such as work being set up to set up a mesh network in Winnipeg's North End. So not only do community-built mesh networks help fill connectivity gaps in a variety of contexts, including urban contexts, they also support digital literacy as participants gain better understanding of connectivity infrastructure and how the internet works. So finally, can I just say one, actually I could finish now if you like, or?
If you just want to give a quick wrap up, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure, yeah. My last point was just addressing barriers around our participation. So just a point that on March 16th, there was a virtual National Day of Action for affordable internet, but many people in rural and northern communities couldn't participate due to slow and expensive internet. So I'll just end with that. It's so ironic that limited connectivity impacts the ability of people in these communities to actually participate in conversations about how to address that issue. So that's my final point. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present.
I had no idea. Oh, I'm glad they're putting some links in for some of the initiatives you discussed. I had no idea there were so many initiatives. I remember KNET. Yeah, it's been around for a long time, and it's an amazing resource for the Indigenous community. So I'd like to turn it over to Jesse Wente. So I'm just going to give a brief bio. Jesse is a Anishinaabe writer, broadcaster, and speaker, and arts leader. He was born and raised in Toronto, and I want to know from where, because I was also born and raised in Toronto, but we'll get to that. His family comes from Chicago and Serpent River. He's been known for more than 2 decades as the columnist for CBC Radio Morning, for CBC Radio Metro Morning. Jesse was with the Toronto International Film Festival for 11 years, the last 7 as the director of film programs at the TIFF Bell Lightbox. He's an outspoken advocate for Indigenous rights, and at the moment he's the chair, board of directors, president for Canada Council for the Arts, and the executive director for Indigenous Screen Office. I'm going to turn it over to you, Jesse. Miigwech.
Oh, thank you so much. And I've just been trying to soak it all in. What incredible knowledge and experience by the fellow panelists. Thank you, Monique, for including me with these, the Gwen and the Smokes. These are powerful people. So yeah, Miigwech for having me. I won't bog us down. I don't have a big presentation to make. I love the story that Rob just told about internet accessibility. This is something that I mention a lot to the government. That I'll give you another anecdote. In speaking with folks from Nunavut, the joke up there was if they wanted to have a movie night, they had to plan in advance and start the week before downloading the movie. It would take a week to download the movie and then they could show it. And you know, the point I make to the government is that as we try to migrate all of our everything, including everything we've done in the last year, to online presence, that will be inequitable. Like that since we don't have an equitable broadband ecosystem currently, by migrating all of the services to that system, you will inevitably end up with inequalities embedded in delivering those services. And this is, you know, even when I think of ISO operations, we're thinking around our next funding round. And of course, it's online, but we also can literally mail you something in case you can't use internet. And I think it's important for policymakers to realize, like, you can't just imagine that everyone is along the southern border. And I think too often in Canada, when it comes to cultural and digital infrastructure policy, all of the folks who are making the decisions, all of the metrics that are being considered are entirely along the southern border of Canada. And I think one of the pieces of knowledge that was shared to me that has really informed the way I think around implementation of policy in Canada, or what is now called Canada, is that colonial vision sees Canada as an east to west place, but that is a misreading of the land. This is a north to south place. And what I mean by that is the cultural differences between East and West are actually fairly small. The cultural differences between South and North, though, are quite dramatic. And so when we consider policy, and because the East to West is all along the southern border, we tend to think of it as, well, we need to think of the Maritimes and we need to think of the West Coast. And we forget that, well, there's this huge, vast territory up there. For when it comes to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit initiatives, the folks in the north of Canada tend to be living more traditional lives for the most part, or often are. They're often in language majority, Indigenous language majority communities, very different than what we face in the South. And so, you know, even if you're considering delivering services into a place like that, well, you better have language speakers. And again, most of our infrastructure and federal departments do not have that necessarily. They concentrate French and English, but I can just say from our experience on the Canada Council, that doesn't work up north. You need to speak the languages of the people from there. So I think it is important we consider all of those readings and really disconnect our colonial worldview of this place in order to enact equitable policy, because in terms of often too much the metrics that we base on even the success policy is based on how it reaches just this small, the majority of the population, but a very small geographical bandwidth. And we have to acknowledge that access is now an issue of democracy and not just one of convenience. That inequitable broadband or digital access to data, access to information, now should be treated, I would argue, more like a utility than it should be as a convenience. Meaning that, and granted, you know, as First Nations people, we understand that the government of Canada has had difficulty delivering even the most basic utilities to all of our communities in an effective manner. That, you know, we have ongoing drinking water issues. That's a utility, and it hasn't been. But just like water has become, or what has always been, you know, a function of our existence and our ability to engage in society, engage in governance, engage in these things, internet has become that. We rely on it. If we wouldn't be doing this right now if it wasn't for this infrastructure. And so, and if we're honest, you know, the consolidation that is actively happening in the major players in the Canadian market will not ultimately benefit, certainly not Indigenous communities, and are unlikely to benefit most of Canadians. So I do think we have to look at policy alternatives, and that may include, you know, and considering that may include treating these things as more of a utility. And I think, you know, what part of what I always talk about is, regardless of whether these companies are actually signed a treaty, they are part of treaty. They exist on lands that are governed by treaties about the sharing of resources. At least in my territory, I know out west there's far less treaties, but here, and yet we don't treat those resources in the same way as others. And I think we need to start doing that. And so if you've laid high, you know, fiber optic line across Canada, well, that's all in Indigenous territory and is profiting from Indigenous lands, and thus we should be ensuring that Indigenous people have equitable and self-determined access to those same things. Otherwise, pretending that we're just pretending we live in a democracy. We're not actually in one that is equal. And, you know, frankly, that's sort of a very Canadian thing, is to pretend that that's what we're doing. So I think I'll stop there, but I'm so appreciative of like all of this and making notes, and it's just so impressive, and I'm so thankful to be here. So Miigwech.
Miigwech, Jesse. Thank you. Yeah, when you're talking about the southern border, my community is only 3 hours northeast of Ottawa, Barrier Lake, or it's known as Rapid Lake. And they don't have, they have very little internet. Even the cell service, you have to go stand by the school and hold your mouth right, like, or people would have to get satellite dishes. They have it for the band office, but it's very limited. And this is 3 hours from Ottawa, from our national capital.
Yeah, we're not even talking particularly north. Like that's not even north. That's like, I don't know what that is. That's still the south. As far as
That's,
I
that's a
can-
suburb of
I can
Ottawa.
tell. It's like still the south. And the thing is, when I talk about it, because obviously we advocate it from a screen sector initiative, but it constricts you in all ways, right? Like you can't be a participant in producing content where you don't have access. You also can't be a consumer. Like it doesn't actually work for either side of what their plan is. It prevents access in all ways. And so, and listen, what I would say is that it makes communities search for alternatives. The Indigenous Screen Office doesn't exist because the existing agencies were doing a good job. Right? It exists because our community needed an alternative to work better for them than those existing things. And so if we're not going to get effective internet from the existing providers, guess what? The communities ultimately will figure this out on their own. And what my thing is, like, that's what I want. So how can I help empower that exact thing? Because I do think communities should figure this out on their own, and what Canada should be doing is letting them, and instead we're wrapped up with these huge multi-billion-dollar things that, like, I'll mention this because it's one of my favorite stats, but I think Canada has like the highest cost data in the world. And like, if you think about that, that's absurd. We've allowed that to happen. That is not a natural occurrence. That is a market regulation issue, and we've allowed monopolies to occur, and monopolies have never ever, as far as I can remember in my understanding of capitalist economies, have never really worked. That they're actually against. You're not supposed to have monopolies. It's supposed to be competition, and yet here we are. That's what we are in Canada, and it's likely we're about to prove another one that is going to be hugely damaging, I think, to the consumer. And none of those companies have shown a willingness to actually deliver great internet. On a couple occasions, I know some communities have worked with them to get internet there, but it's on a community basis, and that requires a different solution than this piecemeal thing that we're doing right now. Anyway, I'll be quiet.
No, it's interesting. Well, it makes me wonder too. I mean, the idea of Indigenous communities, and I'm putting this out there to everybody, developing their own solutions to the internet or lack of accessibility. Because in my community, there was like an 85% language retention. It was huge because they were isolated, because they live off the land. With the internet, with the advent of the internet, the younger generation are no longer speaking the language. And they're trying to take all these drastic measures to ensure that that language is still being learned by the kids. So if that's the kind of impact that it has on community, then what responsibility do communities have to ensure that there is access, but access that allows for the retention of culture and language?
There's something that I think has to be understood here too, that Indigenous people belong to nations, and some people live in communities, but not all. And we use this term community like it's some catch-all for everything now, just like the term First Nation. You can live on a First Nation, you can be a First Nation, whatever. So I think it's really important to really put the context, like I say, in place. And there's Indigenous governing bodies that got to be funded as Indigenous governing bodies to ensure that they're providing their citizens with basic human needs, or to meet the human needs. And now we almost looking at human rights as having internet access as a human right. When you can't get food or you can't get anything else if you don't have it, it's a scary thing. And yes, I've been visited up north, but I live in the south, and different issues, similar issues, different issues. Some are because of geospatial location, and some are just because of political will. So absolutely, I think that there's discussions to have, but the first and the most important thing is to give recognition that we do have governing bodies that need to be empowered and funded so we can participate. Sure, just devolve all the problems to us with no resources, that doesn't solve anything. So my nation had to build our own broadband system. And I love the work that KNet did. Brian Beaton told us a beautiful story about 15 years ago, maybe it was, about when they were doing bringing fiber in, and they left a roll of cable behind, and they said, this is as far as the signal will go. And then I think a year or so later, they went to connect the cable, but the local folks said, oh, strung more. And it carried the signal an extra, I don't know, 100 kilometers or some craziness, right? So yeah, thank you for this opportunity.
Jimmy Gwitch, and I think you're right. Internet is an essential service. It's essential. And so how do we, and I'll lead this, if we've only got a couple of minutes, but I'm interested to hear what people just quickly say. So how do we, what's our next steps? Where do we go from here? How do you see this panning out? I know it's a big question for 2 minutes.
Like I say, our data strategy hopefully is going to address some of these things, and we see it not just the data, but the connectivity component's got to be dealt with as well, right at the same time, right?
Dan and Mary Lou, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that the communication between the generations has to be reclaimed in a way that the language is very important. The language, we have to bring back the language, because in the language, our culture, our identity is there. And so that's so vitally important. Right now, as you say, your young people are losing it in Rapid Lake. So, you know, that's so important. And I think that our young people, I have great hope with young people, because I know that when I was growing up, I saw the look in my grandparents' eyes, you know, that they saw something that I was going to experience, and I've experienced it, and I'm still experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, and I would like to see that in our grandchildren. I would like to see that, and it's up to me, it's up to us to make sure that that happens. And I think collectively, if we're all of the same mind, I think we can do it.
Thank you, Miigwech. How about you, Rob?
Yeah, I don't have much more to add, just to say that, I mean, the evidence is there. People are already doing this work. And I think it's about making sure that the policies and the regulations support the work that's already being done and led by the communities. So all the information, all the work and projects we need is underway. It's just how can it be better recognized and supported?
Terrific. And Jesse, I'll leave the last word to you.
Yeah, I would just very quickly say, I mean, we're seeing the federal government take very baby steps into investing in the content creation side of Indigenous thing. I would like to see an enormous leap on the infrastructure investment side, like invest in the cables, and by that I mean give our, as Gwen said, give our existing national governing bodies the resources to just build it ourselves. View this as an economic driver for the entire nation, not just ours, but it will be for everyone. And that equitable access will only strengthen Canada, not weaken it. And that should be a goal that we can all share. So that's, I would like to, of course, see more support for the content side as well, but I think that's coming. But I would love to see very specific support for the infrastructure side, as Gwen suggests. It's you can't have one without the other. It's foolish to think you can fund the content if you're not also funding the systems for people to be able to create it and consume it.
Miigwech. Well, thank you to everyone. It's already over. I'm sad it's over, because there's all these things I want to ask. And all these places I want to go with this conversation. So thank you very much, Dan, Mary Lou, Gwen, Rob, Jesse. Thank you so much. And thanks to Sarah and everybody for putting this conference together and helping to organize this panel. And I think the conversation does need to continue. And I'm sure that we can find ways to do that. So Kachimi Gwitch, everybody. And I hope you have a good day. Thank you.
And I'm